Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. My name is Kushi Hang. In today's episode, we have PEI colleague Saurabh's conversation with Subash Pandey on Nepal's climate financing dilemma. Subash is a graduate of climate science and policy at Bard College's Center for Environmental Policy, with research interests in the UNFCCC and its implementation architecture. He works in the field of climate and environment with experience ranging from local grassroots organizations to international development and research institutes, both in the global south and the north. He aims to help the least developed and developing countries in achieving their ambitious, nationally determined contributions. In this episode, Saurabh and Subash discuss the hurdles in Nepal's path to climate financing. The discussion is based on the latter's recent op-ed titled Climate Financing Dilemma. They explore both the external limits to Nepal's access to climate funding, especially the ideal grants, and the internal factors that obstruct it from optimizing the funds that do make it in. They also consider the possible steps that Nepal can take to overcome its climate financing dilemma, beginning with the redirecting of its focus from grants to loans. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Another week and another brand new episode of Pods by PI. Today I have with me my guest, Subash Pandey, all the way from the USA, to discuss some of the topics he has discussed in his op-ed published in the Kathmandu Post titled Climate Financing Dilemma on March 1st, 2023. Subash, welcome to Pods by PI. It's great to have you here.
Hi Saurabh, thanks for having me here, and it's my privilege to be here.
Shall we get on with our conversation?
Yeah, of course.
Okay then. So let me begin by asking, what motivated you to write an opinion piece on Nepal's climate financing dilemma?
First, international climate policies, national climate policies are my research interest. So I love to write and communicate on these topics. Second, my research is on Nepal's NDC. So I am studying credibility of Nepal's second nationally determined contribution. And that made me to wonder where the money is coming from to implement Nepal's second NDC. And third, I saw confusion between different stakeholders regarding whether to receive loan or not. So we saw climate protest in Nepal when Nepal signed 100 million loan for a grid project. And so more than that, there was no diversity of opinion. Every single stakeholders, including activists, policymakers, and academicians, they shared same concern, no climate loan. And that made me write because I really felt there was confusion between stakeholders.
So what is Nepal's current climate situation and how is it affecting the country's people and environment? Can you give us an overview of the climate financing landscape in Nepal? How much funding is available and where is the money coming from, like you mentioned in your previous answer?
As we all know, climate change is a global phenomena, but its impacts are local. So if we see the climate modeling for Nepal, the result shows average annual precipitation as well as temperature will rise in short term and long term. And if we see our economic and social aspects, still many people, they rely on forests and agriculture for their livelihood, and these two sectors, they will experience the worst impact. So it means that our social and economic sectors, coupled with other biophysical impacts, make Nepal one of the most vulnerable countries. This is the current situation, and we will experience more disasters related to climate change in the future, and that will be exacerbated by our existing social inequalities and our political and economic situation. And talking about climate financing, there is no exact record of climate finance in Nepal. According to one report published by CARE, Nepal implemented 609 climate-related projects between 2013 and 2017. The total amount was 2 billion. And Nepal has been receiving climate finance from different sources. And there are currently 118 active INGOs in Nepal. And out of them, 18 have projects related to climate change. Similarly, another important source of climate finance for Nepal is UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Under that, there are different financing mechanisms, mainly Global Environmental Facility, Green Climate Fund, and Adaptation Fund. So right now, Nepal has 3 projects under Green Climate Fund, 2 of them related to adaptation and 1 related to mitigation. The total worth of that projects is almost 88 million, but it's so difficult to tell the exact amount of climate finance Nepal has been mobilizing or Nepal received from different international communities. It's not only the case of Nepal, it's a similar story all over the world. It's so difficult to track the number of climate finance being mobilized.
But Nepal also does have a long history of committing and setting highly ambitious targets. In particular, the second NDC that Nepal has submitted was much lauded and highly ambitious. So, how well are we doing to meet those commitments?
When we talk about NDC has 3 components: adaptation, mitigation, and climate finance. So we have been able to come up with ambitious policies. So we developed local adaptation plan of action, national adaptation program of action. And I think Nepal was one of the first country to do that and submit to UNFCCC. And as you said, many international organizations have praised Nepal's second NDC for its quantifiable targets and sectoral coverage compared to its first NDC. And we have very ambitious goals. And when it comes to implementation, we don't have that good record. So talking about progress, we don't have any such report being published from government or any other research agency. So we can't exactly say where do we stand today. But what we can say here is Nepal is really not doing good. So this is 2023. Still, we have not been able to have our concrete NDC implementation plan. First, it's because of our political instability. A Ministry of Forest and Environment, who is focal ministry for climate change, has prepared that NDC implementation plan and submitted it to Parliament, but it's been stalled there for 1 year. And still we have 2 more years to implement our promises, and we are not in good track to achieve those ambitious goals. And I would like to add another important thing. If you see the Nepal's mitigation related goals, we have only goal that is not conditional, but rest of the goals are conditional. So I don't think government has any mechanism to track all those conditional goals. But surely, like, we are not heading in right direction in terms of achieving all the mitigation related goals. And in terms of climate adaptation, I think we have been doing really well because we have implemented climate adaptation projects in local level, particularly in western part of Nepal. But there are some criticism of those adaptation interventions because many scholars, they argue that we did not account existing social inequalities. So there are findings that those adaptation interventions rather increase vulnerability rather than reducing it. Yeah, so I don't think we are really heading in a right direction in terms of mitigation, but we have somehow good achievement when it comes to adaptation.
And then there's also the conversation post COP26, which featured a significant bulk of the discussion on loss and damage. Something that we also covered in our previous episodes hosted by our executive director Soumitra Neopane with Ajay Dixit. So, loss and damage does seem to be simultaneously discussed with climate financing, doesn't it?
Yes, and what we need to distinguish here is loss and damage. It's a relatively new term, and its loss and damage is a general term used in UN climate negotiation to refer to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt. So we agree, developed countries, they agreed to establish separate climate finance as a loss and damage, so which is beyond adaptation and mitigation. So developed countries, they have already promised to provide $100 billion every year starting from 2020. Loss and damage will be additional fund to that 100 billion, but we need to understand the complexity of loss and damage because we have like loss and damage, but we don't know how we are going to materialize it. So there are a lot of uncertainties regarding loss and damage, which I hope in next conference of parties will flesh it out more on it. So I am not highly optimistic with funding from loss and damage because we have already seen how reluctant are developed countries even providing the basic $100 billion. And one of the reasons why they were reluctant to establish loss and damage was lack of evidence for claiming finance for it. And another important thing here we need to notice is, so who will have access to loss and damage? Even let's say we materialize loss and damage and we have climate finance under it, but the question is who will have access to it? So there are other complexities. For instance, Bangladesh might experience flood, Nepal might experience landslide, but the question is, so who will prioritize funding for flooding in Bangladesh over massive landslide in Nepal? So you need to have good research to claim when you claim for loss and damage. So there are a lot of complexities.
So speaking of the actual funds that will be required for climate financing, you also focus on your op-ed that Nepal wants all the climate finance only as grant from external sources. I mean, there is indeed a very strong narrative on the quote-unquote the polluter pays, but how realistic are Nepal's grant-based climate financing demands?
I would like to say Nepal only wanting to have grants is not realistic, and Nepal can get climate finance as grants only, but the question is how much. If we are talking about few millions dollars that we are getting from UNFCCC like Green Climate Fund, yes, we will get only as grants. But if you are talking about mitigation, like big climate projects, and if you want billions-dollar as an investment, then no. There are multiple reasons for this. If you see the conditional and nationally determined contributions, so we will need $4.1 trillion to achieve all those goals. Even like emerging economies like India, Indonesia, South Africa, they have conditional elements in their NDCs, so they will also compete for the same climate finance. And ignoring those emerging economies, if we just focus only on LDCs, there are 46 least developed countries, and implementation of their NDCs require 1.5 trillion. And as we know, like currently we have only $100 billion to mobilize, and within that 65% of climate finance it flows to middle income countries and only 20% to LDCs, and 58% it goes to mitigation. So yeah, it's clear that if we don't develop clear financing strategy, Nepal's goal or Nepal's dream of getting climate finance only as grants is possible, but it will not be able to move the needles of climate actions. We need huge investment if we really want to achieve our ambitious climate goals.
So now we go into some of the major points that you've made through your op-ed. One of the points that you brought, which was also touched upon earlier, was Nepal's reticence to adopt loans, or should I say, this hesitation towards taking climate loans. Would it not be a short-sighted move to reject all climate loans? Rather, would it not be more prudent to take whatever type of financing is available and take climate action now?
Yes, if we don't have clear financing strategy, there will always be confusion. And we need to be very clear with climate finance. We don't want loan for adaptation interventions, but we can take loan and invest in mitigation related projects which is going to yield return in the future. And it's sure, like there are a lot of sectors that we can invest and which has huge potentiality for return. Still, we need to be very careful if it is concessional loan, if we have to pay high interest rate.
So Nepal also has a lot of private investing for national development finance. This is a topic that we covered in our last episodes, where we invited Anup Upreti and Sujesh Kimire. And they spoke at length about how private investing is crucial for our development for the future. So how big of a role do you believe the private sector has to play in Nepal's green financing future?
Nepal can't achieve its ambitious climate goals without the involvement of private sector. But we also need to be very careful that private sector would only come into action if they see prospect for profit. And theoretically, it should be easier to have involvement of private sector in climate sectors, because there are a whole lot of sectors where they can benefit from. First one is electricity generation, because Nepal has planned to generate 5,000 megawatt by 2025 and 15,000 by 2030. Another one is electric vehicles, so where Nepal intends to have 90% of all private passenger vehicles fully electric by 2030. And similarly, Nepal plans to have electric cooking stoves where 25% of households will use electric cooking stoves as primary mode of cooking. This is where Nepal government can tap in private resources, but government of Nepal needs to create that conducive environment. So one thing that really surprises me is, Nepal itself does not have its own coal and fossil fuel resources. Instead of spending billions of dollars importing petroleum products from India, private sectors can tap in and invest in electric vehicles and hydropower, which is not only beneficial for government but also for private sector to generate profit. Here we need to understand is how the private sectors will react, because right now we have all fossil fuel run transportation sectors and electric vehicles. How will they react? Will they lobby against transition to electrification? So this is huge question, which might be a huge barrier for Nepal. Like, we have problem of crony capitalism. So here government needs to really create that conducive environment which really helps private sector for investment in these key three sectors that I highlighted.
Hi there, this is Kushi from Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. We hope you're enjoying Pods by PEI. As you know, creating this show takes a lot of time and resources, and we rely on the support of our community to keep things going. If you've been enjoying the show and would like to help us out, we'd really appreciate it if you could become a patron on Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows listeners like you to support creators like us with a small monthly donation. Your support will go a long way in helping us to continue creating high-quality content for you. So if you're interested in supporting our show and becoming a part of our community, head on over to Patreon and become a patron today. You can find us at patreon.com/podsbypei. Every little bit helps, and we can't thank you enough for your support. Now, let's get back to the episode.
So now we come to the recommendations that you have presented in your op-ed. You've identified quite several key sectors that Nepal needs to prioritize towards improving Nepal's climate change resiliency. So could you please tell our listeners what these key sectors are?
It's all related to mitigation more than adaptation, which is beneficial both environmentally and economically. My recommendation is mainly for mitigation because when it comes to resiliency, we think more of adaptation. For mitigation, the key sector is energy. Though Nepal has 4 key sectors, including industry, waste, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Solutions to climate change should not be seen in silos. We always need to link up with economy. And there are multiple subsectors under energy sector, namely transportation and cooking. We need to understand is, so Nepal imports $1 billion petroleum products from India. And we have another recent example of grounded Saja electric bus because of lack of necessary charging infrastructure. These are the clear sectors where we can invest even with a loan that we can get from international sources. The other co-benefits associated with investment in clean energy is pollution. We can really control pollution in our capital city as well as country-wise. And investment in clean energy, particularly replacing all those fossil fuel based transportation to electric vehicles, will greatly reduce air pollution, and that will help to save us around 3% of GDP to invest in health sectors and treat diseases and all other associated impacts of pollution.
So now we come back to the number that you mentioned earlier, the 1.5 trillion US dollars. So there's a paper that many of the NDCs require a financing of about US $1.5 trillion. But in 2009 at COP15, the OECD member countries committed to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion US dollars per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries, a target they missed by around 16.7 billion US dollars. So here's the bigger question. Is there a disconnect between the messaging from the developing countries, or is this still a case of developed countries not heeding to the message of leaving no one behind?
We need to discuss power dynamics that we see every year at COP to really answer this question. So there are other weaknesses of least developed countries like Nepal, because when we go to COP, we normally don't do our homework, and the structure of the UNFCCC is set up in such a way that will benefit more developed countries than developing one. Because as you know, like countries like Nepal, if they can't strongly present themselves in international fora, then their voice will not be heard. So there are key things that really undermine the position of countries like Nepal. They are delegation from Nepal are small in size, and when they have to negotiate, they have to speak in English, which is not their first language, and they do not have economists and legal experts in their team, which really makes them weak in terms of negotiation. And countries like Nepal really do not have ability to send same negotiators year after year. So why I'm saying this is, if you don't have a strong delegation team, then you really can't negotiate or bargain. So this is really happening, talking about that 100 billion finance. So they come up with promise, but they always fail to implement it. So we need to develop, least developed countries like Nepal, they need to build better coalition. Like we have LDCs, least developed countries coalition, we have small island developing states coalition. So they need to come up together, they need to work together to make their voice strong and to put strong pressure on developed countries. So yeah, it's very important to understand the power dynamics that we get to see in these international negotiations. So unless we balance that, this will keep on happening.
So from where you stand, what are the key recommendations that you see from your perspective that Nepal should prioritize? And what are the various hindrances that Nepal faces to implementing these recommendations?
First of all, as I said, we need to have clear financing strategy. There should not be confusion between different stakeholders. And another important thing Nepal needs to do is it needs to identify national interest. And as I already mentioned, there are a whole lot of sectors under energy where they can benefit from, even with loans that we get from multilateral bank, which is good for us. And we need to identify our national priority. We need to act accordingly. So if we see our neighbors like Bangladesh, they have been doing good jobs. So they have their clear strategy, financing strategy. So they also accept grant for adaptation as well as climate concessional loan for their investment in mitigation sectors. And second thing is competition. So Nepal wants to compete with other LDCs. Nepal wants to present itself as a progressive country when it comes to climate action. First, that clear example is our net zero commitment by 2045. It's so interesting. Way developed country than us, for example, China and India, they have net zero commitment. China has net zero commitment by 2060, and India has net zero commitment by 2070. And I really don't understand like why Nepal came up with net zero commitment by 2045. And at the same time, so we want to achieve double-digit growth, economic growth, and I don't see where both of these climate policies and our ambition to achieve double-digit growth align to each other. So we need to step out from that competitions of seeing as a climate progressive country. We need to understand our reality. And another important thing, political interest. So if you see our history, we had 9 ministers of Ministry of Forest in the last 10 years. I think this does not reflect our seriousness when it comes to climate actions. So every time there is change of not only minister but also bureaucrats, it will take them time to get to know about UNFCCC. So if there is change of top bureaucrats every 2 years, then there will be very weak implementation of policies. And this is where we are where Nepal is really struggling. And the working structure of UNFCCC is so complex, it will take them almost a year to understand the reporting mechanism of UNFCCC. So these are key 3 challenges that Nepal faces right now in terms of climate change policy implementation as well as achieving its net zero commitments by 2045.
And as we are coming towards the end of today's episode, are there any words or messages that you would like to convey to our listeners?
I would like to say we have been doing really good when it comes to climate adaptation. but when it comes to mitigation, we have very ambitious climate goals, and I don't know how credible are those our mitigation related goals.
Thank you, Subash, once again for being with us on today's episode of Pods by PEI. I wish you all the very best in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
So that brings us to the end of today's episode. We'll be back, same place, same time, with another brand new episode of Pods by PEI. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Saurabh's conversation with Subash on Nepal's climate financing dilemma. Today's episode was produced by Nejan Rai with support from Saurabh Lama, Chedon Kansakar, Videsh Sapkota, and me, Khushi Hang. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited by Saurabh Lama. Sound mixing was done by Videsh Sapkota. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Sakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's TWEET followed by the number 2 and PEI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Khushi. We will see you soon in our next episode.